Have you ever felt like it's hard to relate to someone? I felt that way before. I grew up going to a school where from first grade all the way through my senior year in high school, I was with the same school with the same group of friends. And so we grew up and we were really tight because we had shared experiences and interests, and we had stories, and because of that we just had this connection. We were tight, we were close, we could relate to one another. And then after high school, I remember, we started to kind of begin to move on with life a little bit, and I was actually the first one out of my group of friends to get married. I got married at 25, but a lot of them, it was much later. So I got married first, and then I started having kids first, and before I knew it, my life was becoming very different than the lives of my friends. We were going in two different directions, and so after a little while, we discovered that it was just kind of hard to connect and relate to one another at some point. Things were different. There was a divergence between our lives that was so vast, so broad, that it was hard to find ways to relate. So I remember, like, my friends, for example, they would call me up sometimes and say, hey, you want to come hang out tonight? And in the past, I would just say, oh, yeah, no problem. But now I would be like, hold on one second. Hey, sweetie, do you mind if I go? I mean, she was always really cool about it, but you want to make sure that it works for the evening. And so, she said, yeah, go ahead and hang with your friends. So I said, yeah, I can hang out. And they'd say, oh, great, I'll pick you up at 10:30. And I remember just thinking, like, 10:30? Like, I'm in bed by 10:30 now these days. My kids are going to be up in, a matter of hours if I get back in the early morning hours. There was a difference there. My friends would say, hey, did you see this latest scary movie? And I'm like, no, but did you see the latest episode of Paw Patrol? It's really good. Like, our lives were different. We couldn't relate. That's what happens. Sometimes in life, things change. People drift apart. They don't have that connection anymore. They just can't relate. And sometimes that's hard for us to deal with, isn't it? Especially when we're so close to somebody and we're so tight for so long, and then things begin to drift little by little, and before we know it, there's just no relation there anymore. It's hard when that happens. It's hard to deal with. But as difficult as that may be to deal with, I think it pales in comparison to the feeling that perhaps God can't relate to us anymore. You ever have that feeling? In moments of challenge and trial and difficulty and hardship and pain, have you ever felt like God is distant? Like he's clueless. He has no idea what you're going through or what you're feeling or what you're faced with. He's so far removed from your experiences that he's unaware of the situation. He can't identify with you. You ever feel that way? I have. I'm just being honest with you. There are times where I feel that way when I'm going through something significant. Sometimes it just feels like, God, where are you? Like you're way up there in the glories of heaven where I'm sure there are harps and beautiful music and things are great, and I'm down here struggling. It's hard in those moments to feel that connection, that intimacy, that closeness. It's hard to feel like God can relate to us. This is often the way we feel, isn't it? But beloved, hear me this morning. God can relate to you and to me far greater than you probably realize, than any of us realize. There's a far greater connection than we perhaps pay attention to. God can relate to you in your struggle and trial and challenge. And Lord willing, we're going to see that this morning firsthand as we look at the life of Joseph. So go ahead and open your Bibles with me to Genesis chapter 37 this morning. First book in your Bible, chapter 37 of the book of Genesis. And if you have a seatback Bible in front of you, that's great. You can use that. If you brought a Bible, that's okay. If you want to use your phone, that's all right too. If you don't own a physical Bible, the Bible in front of you can take home with you. That's our gift to you today for free. We'd love for you to have a Bible. So, Genesis 37. And as you're turning to Genesis 37, I want to remind you that we're continuing a brand new series that we launched last week. It's all about the life of Joseph. And if you were with us last week, you know that we spent last week giving some background information and telling the birth story of Joseph. And last week, if you were with us, you know that basically Joseph's family was a train wreck. There's no other way to describe them. It was a really terrible upbringing, a terrible background. So to give you some context, remember, Joseph had 11 brothers and 1 sister, and he had 4 moms in the family. Right, that's just a tip of the iceberg for how much drama there was we talked about last week. And so we saw fighting, jealousy, favoritism, deception, dysfunction, throughout the entire story of his birth last week, and it's no surprise that now as we turn to Genesis chapter 37 and we begin to crack open the story of the life of Joseph, nothing has changed. All the drama, all that conflict, it's still there. It's still prevalent in his life. And so without further delay, let's go ahead and dive right in. Normally I put stuff on the screen, but this morning I want to just read because there's a lot more text to cover. And so I'll begin by reading the first section up through verse 11. So let's begin in verse 2 through verses 11. You can follow along in your Bibles, and I'll read if you just want to listen to. It begins by saying, Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel, who's also known as Jacob, he loved Joseph more than any other of his sons because he was the son of his old age. And he made him a robe of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all of his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, hear this dream that I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright. And behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf. His brothers said to him, are you indeed to reign over us? Or are you indeed to rule over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Then he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers and said, behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun and moon and the 11 stars were bowing down to me. But when he told it to his father and his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, what is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come and bow ourselves to the ground before you? And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind. Well, as we begin this first section in our passage this morning, the first thing we really see that really just bubbles out from the text, number one, is the tension. The tension. Can you feel the tension as you read that story? I mean, it's abundantly clear that this is just a bad situation, that something is brewing in the story, that something bad is bound to happen. That's what I feel when I read this. Right from the outset of the story, you can feel the tension. It begins with Joseph, this young man. He's 17 years old, right? He's out in the fields with his brothers, tending to his father's flock. He's working out there, and then he goes to his father, and he brings a bad report about his brothers. Now, we don't know exactly what that bad report was. Maybe it's the way that they were interacting out in the fields. Often when you would tend the flock back in the ancient Near East, that would mean that you're traveling large distances and going all around the countryside. And so they're off on their own. Who knows if they're partying or being involved in certain things they shouldn't. Either way, Joseph is the one that brings the bad report to his father, Jacob, concerning his brothers. Now remember, just a little background information we talked about last week. Other than Benjamin, Joseph is the youngest son. And so apparently little brother is kind of a tattletale. That's what's happening in the beginning of the text, which is already causing tension. But then to make matters worse, notice how the text explicitly says about Jacob or Israel. It says that he loved Joseph more than any other of his sons. Now this isn't good. Maybe some of you grew up in a home where there was favoritism. Maybe some of you grew up in a home where there was a golden child and he was treated or she was treated special. Maybe you were the golden child. That explains the way that you act sometimes, okay? But no, that this happens in families, often. And when it happens, it doesn't go over well. And I realize that sometimes we try really careful to avoid this, especially those of you who are parents. We try hard to not play favorites. This last Christmas, it's not that we bought our kids a lot of presents, it's just that we have 5 kids. So no matter how you slice it, that's a lot of gifts for Christmas. And so we bought gifts for Christmas and we put them in a box in our closet. And my wife, a few days before Christmas, asked me to get out the box so we could kind of make piles of the kids' gifts, because our fear was that we forgot about a kid. That we bought gifts for everybody. Oh, we're set. And then Christmas morning comes and it's like, oh yeah, I totally forgot that one. We didn't get gifts for that one. We wanted to make sure that didn't happen, and it was even. So we tried hard to make sure that happens, and parents often do that. But see, here in Joseph's family, nobody's trying to be even or fair. Like there's no struggle or tension about this, about trying to figure out how we can treat each kid fairly. Jacob, the father, he's blatantly playing favorites. He's making it abundantly clear to everybody that he loves Joseph more than any other of his sons. And he demonstrates this by the fact that he makes for his son a robe of many colors. Now, most garments in the ancient Near East, right, they were not very colorful or flashy. Fashion was kind of not a thing so much there for normal people. It was very utilitarian, your clothing. And so most things that you got, right, they were brown, black, or white, because you would take fur or something like that, or some sort of fabric material, and you would hand spin that, and then you would weave that together. And so whatever the color of the animal or you used, or the skin maybe that you would use for things, that would be the color of the fabric, which it's, not going to be very colorful for the most part. And so most people, they would wear these kinds of things that were just basic. But colorful fabric, that was something that you would find, but it was rare. Because in order to make colorful fabric, you would have to take the material and then you would have to dye it in a color. And dye in the ancient world was very rare, very expensive. Often it was something that was sought after. And so if you did have a garment that was colorful, it was probably one color. Most people wouldn't have a variety of colors, especially in one article of clothing. But here, what we see is clothing that's made of multiple colors. Right? This is exceedingly expensive. This is only for the very rich or the very powerful. This is often something that would be a regal garment, something you would see a king wearing because of the value and the cost of something like this. And so here, Jacob, he spares no expense for his favored son. He goes all out, and he has this very expensive coat of many colors made for his beloved son, Joseph. And when his brothers see this, when they realize what their father has done for this brother, it says that they hated him. It says they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. This is going to be bad news for this family. Clear favoritism. Clear. This gift that the father has given to the son, this is going to be a source of divisiveness and contention and conflict, and we're going to see it play out further down the story. This is a very bad gift as far as this relationship works, and it's tricky when stuff like that happens. I remember we had one Christmas growing up. I had a family member who normally wasn't part of the gift-giving process, but they were around at Christmas, and so they brought gifts. And so it was cool, because me and my brother were like, hey, sweet, these are bonus gifts. These are not normal gifts. These are unexpected bonus gifts. So we were excited. And I opened my gift first, and I got a rubber Pistons basketball. And I was pumped about it, because, I didn't expect a bonus gift. I liked basketball. It was cool. This Pistons, so it was like, sweet. And that's why I was really excited about that. I was happy and content with my gift. Appreciative. And then my brother opened his gift next, and I watched him open his gift. And what he opened was a Sega Genesis, right? So for those of you who, I know there's some young people in the room. So a Sega Genesis, just so you know, is like the PlayStation 4 of 1991. Okay, it's awesome. It came with Sonic the Hedgehog. You guys remember Sonic? I just remember the theme music still. It's such a great game. Sonic was the game that came with it. And my brother opened up the Sega Genesis, and he was so excited and thrilled. And here I am. Previously, I was very appreciative, right, with my rubber basketball, which was $3.99 at Walmart. But his $100+ Sega Genesis, I was just beginning to just be so envious and jealous, and pretty soon bitterness kind of started to well up. And I was a little bit upset about my gift compared to his. It became a source of contention. And clearly, I'm not over it yet, because I'm still talking about it, right? So Lord maybe has some work to do in my heart about this Sega Genesis. But here in the same way, this gift from Jacob to Joseph, it's causing problems in the family. It's causing bitterness and tension. And it doesn't even stop there. It just continues to get worse. It escalates. Notice how Joseph has two dreams. We're not going to take time to talk at length about the dreams. There's a lot of text to cover today, so we're just going to mention them. He has two dreams, right? The first dream is about sheaves of grain, right? So you have these stalks of grain that when they're harvested, you bundle them together. And he has this dream about the sheaves, the 11 sheaves bowing down to him. That's his brothers bowing down to him. And then he has a dream about the sun, moon, and stars, and 11 stars bowing down to him. And so the sun and moon will be his father and mother, although it's interesting because, a little nerdy thing, his mother's dead at this point in the story because she died giving birth to his son Benjamin. So we don't really exactly know who represents the mother in the story, but maybe someone was raising him. Maybe it was his mother's maidservant. But either way, in his dreams, everybody in his family is bowing down to him. But he's becoming the ruler of the family. And these are visions that are obviously from God. In fact, one of the things that you'll notice a pattern throughout the Joseph story is dreams are frequent in Joseph's story, and they come in pairs. And that's common in the Bible when dreams come in pairs that mean the same thing. It's to try to validate and confirm that what the dream was given, it's going to come true. It's real. And so he had two dreams. This is something that comes from the Lord, and that he's going to rule over his family. And when his family hears about these dreams, and they're livid, they're so upset about them. And as I've been studying this, to be fair, it's hard to blame Joseph in this situation, right? I mean, he wasn't the one initiating any of this stuff. He wasn't the giver of the coat. He was the recipient. He wasn't the giver of the dreams, right? He was the recipient of the dream. And so for us to say, hey, Joseph, man, what a jerk that he was, this favorite son who had all this stuff happening. I mean, he was the one this was happening to. He wasn't initiating these things. So it's really hard to blame Joseph here. And yet at the same time, I think the biblical author is kind of quick to also demonstrate that maybe Joseph isn't so innocent. Because the truth is, he's not trying to hide any of this. Or this coat that he gets from his dad, we're going to see in a little bit, he tends to wear this a lot and flaunt it a little bit too much. That'll cause problems later in the story. And not only that, the dream he's given, well, yes, this is an amazing dream. Perhaps, right, given this vision from the Lord, he could have taken it, digested it, quietly shared it with his father who had a close relationship with him or something like that. But it seems to me, at least in my opinion of reading this narrative, that he's kind of just broadcasting this to the world. Whether he's either really naive or he's super excited that everybody's going to bow down to him. One way or another, he's loud and proud about the dream that he's received. And it's going to create problems for Joseph down the road. And so, because of this, it says they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. And so the first thing we see as we begin reading through this passage, number one, is the tension. The tension. But as we pick back up and continue reading, starting in verse 12 through verse 24, we're going to see this narrative continue to unfold, and the tension is going to rise and reach a climax. Let's go ahead and read this next section, beginning in verse 12. It says, "Now his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem. And Israel, or Jacob, said to Joseph, 'Are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them.' And he said to them, 'Here I am.' So he said to him, 'Go now, see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring me word.' So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. And a man found him wandering in the fields, and the man asked him, 'What are you seeking?' 'I'm seeking my brothers,' he said. 'Tell me, please, where they are pasturing the flock.' And the man said, 'They have gone away, for I heard them say, let us go to Dothan.' So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. They saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. They said to one another, 'Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams.' But when Reuben heard it, he rescued him out of their hands, saying, 'Let us not take his life.' And Reuben said to them, 'Shed no blood, throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand to restore him to his father.' So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore, and they took him and threw him into a pit. The pit was empty, there was no water in it." Well, as we continue reading this next section, the next thing we see begin to unfold. Number two is the treason. The treason. This family, which families in the ancient Near East were supposed to be close and tight. They were supposed to protect each other and care for each other and be concerned for one another's well-being. What we see is that's not the case at all. There's treason that takes place. Joseph is betrayed by his brothers. After sharing his dreams with the family, what we see begin to happen at first is Joseph, he's sent on a mission to check on his brothers who are out tending the flock. And so what happens is Jacob says, go check out and find out what's going on with your brothers. And so he sends him from the valley of Hebron all the way north to Shechem. Now I grabbed a map here to kind of show you where that's at. This is not like Joseph is taking kind of a long stroll down the block. He's not walking from here to Kroger. No, he's walking a long way. This is perhaps 50 miles of a journey. So this is taking many days, lots of time for him to search for his brothers and figure out where the flock is and where they're pasturing. And so he's going to look for his brothers, and he takes this long trip. And when he finally gets there to Shechem, he realizes his brothers aren't there. It's not like they've called ahead. They don't have cell phones. They're not updating the family on where they're at. There's no GPS. He's looking for his brothers. And so he gets to Shechem, and a man says, oh, I think they're at Dothan. So he then travels maybe 15 miles further north to Dothan. So at this point, he's traveled probably over 60 miles to find his brothers. And finally, as he approaches them from a long way off, they see him from a distance, and they begin to plot and scheme. Now, let me ask you a question. How do they see him from a distance? His coat of many colors. This dude goes on this long trip, right? He probably should have packed light. This is a long trip. But he made sure he's going to bring his coat. Right? They're in Israel. Why do you need a coat? I mean, he has this, it's probably cold, but either way, he brings this coat of many colors, and he goes strolling up to his brothers like it's no big deal with this elaborate, opulent gift from his father. And the moment his brothers see him walking with this coat of many colors, inside their heart wells up all these feelings, is drumming up all these emotions, right, of hurt and pain, jealousy. He's the favorite son. Man, he's got these dreams. All these things are coming up in their heart. They see him from a distance, and they begin to plot and scheme to kill him. And so it says this, our text says, and they said to one another, here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams. You see what's happening here? They don't just want to kill Joseph. They want to kill his dream. They want to kill the dreams because in their mind and heart, this is the final straw. Oh, this guy, our younger brother, the favored golden boy, he's going to rule over us? No, I don't think so. And so they see him walking from a distance, and they say, no, we're going to end his life, and we're going to put an end to those dreams. He will not rule over us. So much dysfunction, so much strife and jealousy and conflict. And so we read these brothers, they're really demonstrating a mob mentality. Notice how in this part of the story, as the brothers are conspiring, there's nobody that's rising up, and there's nobody it's just them in unison almost saying, come, let us do this. It's this mob mentality. And thankfully, at one point, Reuben, he speaks up. He's the older brother. He's the only one that shows concern for his family, probably mostly showing concern for his father. He's got a big obligation to care for his father. And so he convinces his brothers not to kill Joseph, but to simply throw him in a pit, which was a cistern. It was like a well that was dug out that was often supposed to fill up with water, and this one was dry. And so that's what they do. They strip him of his robe. They throw him in the pit. And so again, the second thing we see here is the treason. Right? They're committing treason, betraying their brother. And that leads now to our final section. Let's go ahead and read from verses 25 through the end. It says, then they sat down to eat. And looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels bearing gum, balm, and myrrh on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, what profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hands be upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh. Wow, how sweet he is. And his brothers listened to him. Then Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. They took Joseph to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes and returned to his brothers and said, the boy is gone, and where shall I go? Then they took Joseph's robe and slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in the blood. And they sent the robe of many colors and brought it to their father and said, we have found. Please identify whether it is your son's robe or not. And he identified it and said, it is my son's robe. A fierce animal has devoured him. Joseph is without a doubt torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his garments. Right, this is a sign of mourning. And put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, no, I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning. Thus his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. Well, as our story wraps up, the final thing we see, I'm going to call this final section, number 3, the transaction. The transaction. After they plot to murder their brother, they violently throw him in the cistern. And now, notice though, in this section as it begins, the very first thing they do after they throw him in is they sit down to eat. This just stands out to me for whatever reason, right? Imagine this. They're talking about killing their brother. They decide not to kill him. Instead, they throw him in this big pit, and then they're going to probably do something to him. And in the midst of all this, one of them goes, hey, you guys kind of hungry? And they're like, yeah, I'm kind of hungry. I could probably eat. So they sit down and they eat. Isn't that weird? It seems kind of callous to me. And nobody's feeling guilty. Nobody's conflicted about what's just happened. Nobody's lost their appetite. No, they sit down and they have a meal in the midst of all this treason. How heartless do you have to be to do something like this? How bitter and hardened does your heart have to be? It's kind of scary to think about, but you see, that's what happens sometimes, doesn't it? You ever notice when you're bitter and when you're allowing that to well up in your hearts over time, that you do and say and act in ways that normally you probably wouldn't? You grow callous in your heart. This is often what happens when we allow bitterness to take root in our heart. Often we take people made in the image of God, and instead of seeing them for who they are, we strip them of their humanity, and we begin to treat them in ways that are utterly just terrible. And this is what happens. And so their heart is so hardened that in the midst of all this, they sit down and they just eat. They have a meal. Now, it's important to probably note here that Reuben, the only brother who actually cares about anybody in this situation, he is apparently gone. He's mysteriously not part of this passage. And later on, we find out that he comes back and realizes that things have transpired, and so he's gone. We don't know if he's tending the flock and taking care of them while his brothers are at the pit, or we don't know what's happening. But all we know is as they're sitting down to eat, in rides this caravan of Ishmaelites, or this group of people who are trading goods, and they're on their way down to Egypt. They're probably coming with camels and who knows, and they're bringing all these items so they can trade, and on their way to Egypt, this is where the brothers begin to conspire. Now, interesting is if anybody's ever traveled to the Middle East, I spent a little time in Egypt, and when you're out kind of in the desert area, the wilderness, I went to Sinai Peninsula, you'll see these caravans of people, Arab people, descendants of Ishmael, who will travel, and then if you come across any of them, a lot of times they'll get off and they'll try to barter with you and trade things. It's really interesting, and they look like they came straight out of the ancient Near East. So this is what's going on. This group of people are coming. Judah, he sees them, and he seeks to capitalize off them. Right? He has a plan. Instead of just killing their brother and killing his dream, they can actually kill 3 birds with 1 stone, because they can just trade him, right, and sell him into slavery. Then the brother's gone, Joseph's gone, and then his dream is done away with, and then they can also pocket some extra cash. And so that's what they do. They sell their brother. Joseph becomes nothing more than an object in a transaction. He's gone, his dreams are gone, and now these guys have 20 extra pieces of silver on their way back to dad. It's just a sad story. And the story wraps up with the brothers. They return to their father, right? They have Joseph's tattered coat, this coat of many colors that they've dipped in animal blood, and they try to use this to deceive their father into believing that Joseph is dead, that he's been torn to pieces by wild animals, which is ironic if you think about it, because they use an animal to deceive their aging father into believing something false about their brother, and that's the very same thing that Joseph did to his father Isaac when he stole Esau's blessing. But either way, that's what happens. And in the end, Jacob, he goes down to the grave. It says he's going to go down to his grave mourning because now his favorite son is dead. And that's where this week's story ends. It's a sad story, isn't it? Tragic. Really sad example of just family conflict and fighting and drama and issues. It's just a sad story. And as I read this story, one of the things I've always thought was super interesting about this story is as you're going through the story, Joseph, you hear his voice often in the beginning of the chapter, but as soon as bad things start happening to Joseph, have you ever noticed how he's mysteriously silent? We don't know anything about Joseph and what he's thinking and feeling during all this. The moment that his brothers begin to deceive him and then throw him into the pit and plot to kill him and sell him into slavery, we never hear Joseph's voice. And I always kind of wondered, what was Joseph thinking? What was he feeling during this time? Maybe he started to question whether or not God was really in control. Maybe he started to doubt that his dream was actually going to come true. Maybe he started to feel like God was distant, like God was disconnected in some way, like God was so far removed from the situation that he couldn't possibly know what Joseph was going through because Joseph was facing so much difficulty, and if God was truly relating to Joseph, then God would never allow this stuff to happen in the first place. Maybe that's what he's feeling. Maybe he's feeling like God can't relate, like God is distant, like he's absent. Now that's all speculation. We don't have Joseph's voice. But based on my experience, I'd be feeling that way. And I'm willing to bet that you probably would feel very similar as well. Isn't that what we do sometimes? God, if you're real, God, if you're there, God, if you knew what was happening to me right now, then you wouldn't let this stuff happen. God, why on earth am I going through this trial like this? Are you even around? Do you see what's happening to me? Where are you, God? Why am I going through this? Why do I feel so alone right now? If you're familiar with what I was going through, then this wouldn't happen. I know, because if you could relate to me, you wouldn't let this happen. Why can't you relate to me, God? That's how we often feel. That's how we think. See, the truth is, God can relate. God does relate. Jesus does relate to us. And he relates to Joseph. In fact, I'm willing to say and concede that Jesus relates more to Joseph than anybody else in this room. He knows exactly what it's like. There's a connection between Jesus and Joseph that's far deeper than any connection we might have. Think about it for a second when we look at this story through the lens of Jesus. Think about it from this perspective. Jesus was also the also the object of his Father's special love. Jesus was also promised divine exaltation before his people. Jesus was also sent by his Father on a mission to find his lost brothers. Jesus was also hated by his brothers who conspired to kill him. Jesus was also stripped of his robe. Jesus was also betrayed for pieces of silver. Jesus' body was also placed in a pit. Jesus was also exiled. He was exiled from the land of the living. In every way, Jesus can relate to Joseph. This story, Jesus, he lives it out in the flesh. Everything that Joseph experiences, Jesus experiences in the Gospels. And just as Jesus experienced this miraculous resurrection, if we continue reading the Joseph story, unbeknownst to him, by the time he gets to Egypt, God uses that experience to create this miraculous resurrection and save many lives. Jesus can relate. Jesus can relate far more than we probably realize. He's not disconnected. He's not out of touch. The truth is, Jesus can relate. This is the big idea this morning. We do not have a high priest who's unable to sympathize with us in our struggles and challenges and weaknesses and trials. We do not. The truth is, Jesus can relate. He can relate to us. He can relate to you. He can relate to me. Because God did not send his Son into the world to be this bodiless deity who hovers above us and exercises his will in ways that are supernatural. No, he sent his Son who took on human flesh, and he dwelled among us, and he lived a human life. This is Jesus. He experienced humanity. He lived through the pain. He lived through the hurt. He endured the hardship. In fact, he endured all that for you and for me. Because if Jesus didn't take on human flesh, there's no way he could be the one that becomes the substitute sacrifice for humanity. He's the one that takes our place. He lived the life that we can never live, and he died the death that we deserve. He's our sacrifice before God, before a holy God. And so hear me this morning. He's not absent. He's not distant. He's not disconnected. He's not out of touch. Jesus can relate. Wherever you are this morning, he can relate to you. This is our God. And so I don't know this morning what the situation is for you, but if you're feeling lonely this morning, if you're feeling depressed, if you're feeling betrayed, if you're feeling broken, if you're feeling hurt, if you're feeling unwanted, if you're feeling unloved, if you're feeling like you just can't make it any further, I want you to know Jesus can relate. He's been there. That's who he is. He can relate to you. He can relate to Joseph. That's our God. And so I don't know for you this morning, as you're looking at next steps in life and you're wondering what to do next, I want you to know that throughout this story, the Joseph story, from here on forward, God is going to providentially use Joseph's terrible circumstances, which at times seem to get better, but then get worse. And then maybe seems like it's going to get better, it gets worse. God is working and orchestrating and moving parts and pieces throughout the story, because in the end, God has an amazing plan for Joseph. And I just want to share with you, whatever you're facing, God has an amazing plan for you. I believe it. That's why you're here. But I want you to know He hasn't abandoned you. And He's not disconnected from you. He's not out of touch. In the midst of the trial, in the midst of the hardship, as you navigate through this difficult life, He can relate to you. There's a connection there. He knows what you're going through. So trust Him. Whatever may happen, trust Him. Let's pray. Father, I thank You that as we look at the life of Joseph, we have a story of tragedy and hardship. I'm not thanking You for that because it's great that Joseph had to endure suffering. That's a difficult thing to have to endure. I'm thanking You that You recorded this in Your word, that You breathed out this incredible message, because for those of us who are going through hard times right now, this perhaps is exactly what we need to hear, that we are not in this alone. That the hardship we're facing is not exclusively for us. We're not unique in that. That, Father, that this has been experienced before, not just through Joseph, but, Father, through Your Son, Jesus. Father, I thank You that You're a God who draws near to the brokenhearted. I thank You that You're a God who draws near to His people, who knows what His people are experiencing and feeling, because in every way Your Son Jesus experienced it. We do not have a high priest who's unable to sympathize with us, but Father, He can sympathize with us in all these ways. And Father, I thank You for that. And so for the one in the room this morning who needs to hear this, Lord, I pray that Your Spirit would just impress upon their hearts the need to embrace the fact that, yeah, You can relate to us. You know. And that we can turn to You and trust You for whatever we may face, because, Father, You're not done with us yet. Our story isn't over. And so, Father, just help us this morning to believe that, to accept that, to embrace that. We ask and pray all these things in the precious name of Your Son, Jesus Christ.